Olivia, you are making history in the WNBA, not just for a rookie, but for any player. The fastest to 300 points, 100 rebounds, 100 assists.
The fastest to 300 points, 100 rebounds, 100 assists. Wow, this is my first time hearing that, actually. So Holly didn't even say it was just for rookies. She said it was for all time. Oh my goodness. They're kind of erasing Caitlin Clark from history to prop up others. They tried it with Paige, Angel Reese, now Olivia Miles. It doesn't make any sense to me. You know what they say, not providing full context is just as good as lying. You guys were right once again. You guys were right once again. And the more I look at these stats that are being highlighted by ESPN and national media, the more I realize that they are excluding Caitlin Clark and erasing her from history once again. But I'm just here to let you guys know that it's definitely an agenda going on right in front of our face. I apologize for not looking into this sooner. There are two standards being applied to Caitlin Clark's rookie season and Olivia Miles' rookie season. Olivia Miles' rookie season versus WNBA all-time history.
You were right. If you've been watching this unfold, if something felt off about how ESPN was covering Caitlin Clark's rookie season compared to everyone else, you were absolutely right. What we're about to walk through isn't speculation or conspiracy theory. It's documented, time-stamped, side-by-side receipts of statistical manipulation happening in real time on one of the biggest sports platforms in the world. Between late June and late July, ESPN Insights posted 4 separate graphics celebrating Olivia Miles as a record holder. 4 graphics in less than 4 weeks. Each one crowned her as the fastest to reach a milestone. But here's what makes this different from normal sports coverage. Every single graphic used a completely different statistical threshold, not slightly adjusted. Fundamentally rebuilt from scratch every time the old numbers stopped working. This is what happens when you prioritize a narrative over accuracy, and we caught them. The evidence is airtight, documented, and about to expose exactly how the record books got rewritten right in front of us. This isn't just about one bad post or a simple mistake in the graphics department. This is about a pattern so deliberate, so calculated, that it requires explanation. It requires accountability. It requires the entire basketball community to understand that the statistical foundation they're building their understanding on has been compromised. When ESPN Insights, with its reach and authority, decides to construct false records to serve a narrative, it affects how millions of casual fans understand the sport. These aren't just numbers. These are the stories we tell about greatness, about legacy, about who belongs in the conversation of all-time talent. And right now, that conversation has been poisoned by institutional manipulation that operates in plain sight. By the time we're done, you won't just see what happened. You'll understand exactly how it happened, when it happened, and most importantly, why it happened. Let's start with June 29th. That's when ESPN Insights posted their first graphic celebrating Olivia Miles. The claim was bold and specific. Miles was now the fastest player in WNBA history to reach 350 points and 100 assists. The graphic was clean, professional, the kind of post that gets shared thousands of times across social media without anyone questioning it. Why would they? ESPN is the authority on this stuff. They have entire departments dedicated to statistical accuracy. They have researchers, fact-checkers, people whose literal job is to verify information before it goes public. This is their job. This is what they do. Except on June 29th, their job descriptions seem to change in ways that nobody could have predicted. Here's what bothers most people when they first see this graphic. It doesn't mention rebounds at all. And that's not an oversight. That's a choice. That's a deliberate editorial decision made by someone who understood the implications of including rebounds in the statistical threshold. When you look at the actual game logs, when you do the work to verify what both players had actually accomplished, you find something interesting. At the exact same game count, where Miles hit 350 points and 100 assists, Caitlin Clark had already crossed a much higher threshold in multiple categories. Clark had 104 rebounds to Miles' 91. That's not close. That's a 13 rebound gap. That's the difference between two completely different statistical profiles. That's the difference between a good performance and a dominant, historic performance. So why remove rebounds from the equation? Because the moment you include rebounds with those points and assists, Caitlin Clark's dominance becomes undeniable. It becomes impossible to construct an alternative narrative. Clark didn't just have more rebounds, she had more of everything. More points at earlier game counts, more assists, more efficiency across the board, more everything that matters in basketball. But if you're an ESPN graphics department and you've decided that Olivia Miles is the story you want to tell, then you have a problem. A big problem. The actual statistics don't cooperate with your predetermined narrative. They work against it. What ESPN did next reveals how deliberate this was. They didn't just ignore rebounds. They actively constructed a statistical category that excluded them. They went searching for the exact combination of stats where Miles looked impressive and Clark didn't have an even more impressive alternative weighting in the wings. They built it custom. They reverse engineered it. This isn't tracking a record. This is shopping for one. This is building a narrative first and then reverse engineering the statistics to fit it. This is taking the conclusion and working backwards to find the data that supports it. Think about what legitimate statistical tracking actually looks like. A real organization picks a category, like fastest to 300 points, 100 rebounds, and 100 assists, and they stick with it. Game after game, season after season, year after year, era after era. Whether those numbers favor their preferred storyline or not, whether they help the narrative they're trying to push or they contradict it, the category stays consistent. That's the whole point of keeping records. They're supposed to mean something. They're supposed to be stable anchors that we can reference across eras and compare players fairly. They're supposed to be true. But that's not what happened here. ESPN Insights didn't pick a category and stick with it through thick and thin. They picked a result first. They decided they wanted Olivia Miles to be celebrated as a record breaker. They made that decision somewhere in the ESPN hierarchy. Then they went hunting for the statistical combination that would make that narrative work. When rebounds didn't cooperate, they removed them from the equation. When points needed adjustment, they changed the threshold. When assists didn't fit, they manipulated that number too. Every single element was movable, adjustable, designed to produce a predetermined outcome. The scariest part? Most people would never catch this. A casual fan scrolls through social media, sees an official ESPN graphic posted from an official ESPN account with the ESPN logo and the ESPN branding, and accepts it as fact without question. They don't have time to pull up box scores. They don't have the inclination to cross-reference game logs. They don't compare it to other players' timelines and historical data. They see a professional-looking post from a trusted source, and they trust it implicitly. That's not stupid. That's not naive. That's normal. That's what happens when you assume the institutions that control information are acting in good faith. That's what happens when you assume they have the integrity to report truthfully. But here's the thing about good faith. It only works when it's actually there. And on June 29th, when ESPN Insights posted that first graphic, good faith went out the window. Because the decision to exclude rebounds wasn't made in a vacuum. It wasn't made without understanding the consequences. It was made knowing that rebounds would expose the manipulation. It was made with full awareness that including them would make Caitlin Clark's accomplishment look bigger, faster, and more dominant than Olivia Miles' version. That knowledge was there. That calculation was made. What happened next proved this wasn't a mistake. It proved it was a pattern. It proved it was intentional. 2 weeks after that first graphic, July 13th rolled around. ESPN Insights posted again. This time the milestone was different from the first one. Now they were celebrating Olivia Miles reaching 400 points, 100 rebounds, and 100 assists. Notice that change? Rebounds were back in the equation. Notice that? The stat that disappeared from the first graphic suddenly reappeared in the second one. That's not inconsistency. That's not a random variation. That's confirmation. That's proof that every element of these posts was being adjusted based on what the actual numbers showed at any given moment. Why did rebounds come back into the equation? Because between June 29th and July 13th, Olivia Miles finally crossed the 100 rebound threshold. The obstacle that had kept her out of the 300-100-100 record was gone. She finally hit it. She reached the milestone. And the moment she did, rebounds got reincorporated into the statistical category ESPN was tracking. The definition changed immediately. That's not coincidence. That's not independent decision-making happening in a vacuum somewhere in the ESPN building. That's someone watching the numbers like a hawk, seeing when Miles cleared each barrier and adjusting the graphics accordingly to maintain the narrative. This is the moment the pattern becomes undeniable to anyone paying attention. You can't claim these are independently created statistics when they change structure the exact moment a new benchmark is reached by your preferred player. You can't argue these are standard records being tracked across the league when the definition shifts based on real-time game data from one specific player's season. This is reactive, not predictive. This is responsive to what happens on the court, not deterministic of what should be tracked. This is building to order, not discovering what's already there in the historical record. Think about the message this sends if you're someone who understands what's happening. Think about what a graphics department has to believe about their audience to execute this strategy successfully without getting caught. They have to believe that nobody's paying close enough attention to notice that rebounds disappeared and then came back. They have to assume that casual fans won't cross-reference between posts separated by weeks. They have to count on the fact that most people only see one graphic in isolation, not the full sequence. That's a calculated bet on audience and attention. That's banking on the idea that people consume content in fragments. But that calculation was wrong, because fans started paying attention. People started screenshotting these posts and saving them. People started pulling up game logs and doing the actual math themselves. People started creating spreadsheets and timelines. And once you put these graphics side by side, when you look at them as a complete sequence rather than isolated posts, the manipulation becomes impossible to hide or deny. The same statistical category can't have two different definitions in different posts. You can't remove a component one week and add it back the next week unless you're actively changing the rules based on what the numbers show at that moment. There's no other explanation. And what makes this even more damning is the timing. ESPN didn't post these graphics months apart where people might forget the previous definitions and lose track of what was claimed before. They didn't space them out over a full season where the context would blur. They posted them within days and weeks of each other, all during the same intensive period of Miles' rookie season when everyone was paying close attention. That concentration of posts, all with shifting thresholds, all adjusted specifically when Miles hit new milestones that ESPN wanted to celebrate, that's not a coincidence. That's a coordinated effort to build a narrative through selective statistical presentation. The other thing that matters for understanding what happened, nobody at ESPN publicly acknowledged these changes. Nobody issued a statement. Nobody said, "Hey, we've adjusted our methodology here based on new thresholds we're tracking." Nobody explained why rebounds disappeared and came back. Nobody addressed the shifting thresholds and why they kept changing. The posts just kept coming, clean and professional looking, with the official ESPN branding and everything, with no acknowledgement that the previous post's definition was now obsolete or had been abandoned. That silence is intentional. That's by design. That's how you avoid accountability. You never acknowledge the inconsistency exists in the first place. You just move forward as if it was always this way. This is the moment where oversight stops being a plausible explanation for what happened. One bad graphic, maybe that's a simple mistake. Maybe someone wasn't paying attention. Two graphics with different standards, that's starting to look intentional. That's starting to look like a pattern. But when you see the pattern hold across 4 separate posts, each one adjusted specifically when the previous threshold became untenable, you're not looking at oversight anymore. You're looking at methodology. You're looking at someone tracking the numbers carefully enough to know exactly when to post and exactly how to structure each post to serve a predetermined narrative. And the narrative was clear to anyone watching. Olivia Miles as the record breaker. Caitlin Clark as erased from the conversation entirely. By July 22nd, ESPN Insights had moved on to their 4th graphic in less than 4 weeks of constant posting. This time, the threshold had escalated again in ways that would be hard to defend. Now they were celebrating Olivia Miles reaching 500 points and 150 assists. Notice what's missing from this definition? Rebounds disappeared again. The stat that had been reincorporated on July 13th was suddenly gone again by July 22nd, just removed entirely. And there's a very specific reason why that happened at that moment. When you look at the actual numbers at this point in Miles' season, she had fewer than 110 rebounds total. She was nowhere near the 150 rebound mark. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark had 150 rebounds. That's a 40 rebound gap between the two players. That's a massive gap. That's not even in the same universe statistically. So what does ESPN do when they encounter a number that makes their preferred narrative look weak or false? They remove it from the equation entirely. They delete it. Rebounds got deleted from the record books a second time. Not because rebounds stopped being important to the game of basketball. Not because the league changed its statistical tracking methods, but because including rebounds would expose Caitlin Clark's superiority across the board in a way that's impossible to argue with. Here's where the escalation becomes really obvious to anyone following along with receipts. The points threshold jumped from 350 to 400 to 500. That's a significant increase each time. The assists threshold jumped from 100 to 100 to 150. That's an increase that breaks the pattern of the first two posts. Every single number kept moving higher and higher. That's not normal record tracking behavior. That's not how sports organizations track records. That's someone systematically raising the bar every time the previous bar threatened to include Caitlin Clark in the achievement. It's a moving target that keeps shifting, and the target only moves in one direction, away from Clark's accomplishments and toward Miles' eventual achievements. Think about what this pattern actually proves about intent. If these were real, static records that ESPN had decided to track from the beginning, then they would reach them at specific moments and then stop reaching them forever. Olivia Miles would hit the 350-100 threshold, and that record would be set in stone. It would be entered into the books permanently. It would be done. You'd move on to other statistics or other players entirely. That's how records work in the real world. They mark a moment. They mark an achievement. Then they sit in the record books until someone else breaks them decades later. But that's not what happened here. Instead, the moment Miles hit one threshold, a completely new threshold appeared. And that new threshold had different components, different numbers, completely different requirements. It's like the record keepers were literally moving the finish line every time Olivia Miles approached it. Finish line at 350, okay, but now it's at 400. Finish line at 400? Great, now we're moving it to 500. And by the way, we're changing what categories count and what categories we're ignoring. Rebounds in, rebounds out, rebounds in, rebounds out. It's a shell game with statistics. The assist threshold increase is particularly telling and damning. When ESPN jumped from 100 to 150 assists as a requirement, they weren't doing this in a vacuum or randomly. They were doing this at a moment when Caitlin Clark had 194 assists and Olivia Miles had 149. Miles was one assist away from hitting a 150 assist threshold, and ESPN was right there watching that number climb like a hawk. So what did they do? They moved the threshold up to 150 and framed it as a real, predetermined record that had always been significant. But 150 assists wasn't a predetermined goalpost they had established before the season. It was a goalpost they constructed specifically because Miles was approaching some threshold and they wanted to make her achievement look historic. If they had picked 150 assists as their threshold from the beginning of the season, they would have mentioned it clearly in the first graphic. They would have said explicitly, "We're tracking the fastest to 300 points, 100 rebounds, and 150 assists, because that's the modern benchmark that defines historic production." Instead, they randomly changed the assists requirement only after introducing a completely different points threshold. That's not consistency. That's chaos. That's the statistical equivalent of rearranging the furniture every time a guest walks into the room. And the silence around all of this is deafening to anyone paying attention. No ESPN analyst acknowledged that they were changing their methodology. No graphics department issued a statement explaining why rebounds kept disappearing and reappearing like magic. No official clarification about why the thresholds were escalating every time. The posts just kept coming, clean and professional looking, implying that these were established records being tracked rather than custom categories being built in real time based on one player's performance. What ESPN was doing, what they're still doing, is using the authority and reach of their platform to rewrite the statistical record. They're not just reporting on basketball anymore. They're actively constructing which accomplishments count and which ones get buried. And they're doing it so smoothly, so professionally, with such an air of authority and expertise, that most people don't even notice the manipulation happening right in front of them on their screens. But the fans noticed, the community noticed, and once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it ever again. Let's get into the actual numbers because details matter here more than anywhere else. The numbers don't lie and they don't have agendas. When you pull the game logs and look at specific moments in the season, at 19 games, at 21 games, at 24 games, at 25 games, a picture emerges that no amount of threshold shifting can obscure or hide. At every single checkpoint throughout this period, Caitlin Clark was ahead. Not slightly ahead in minor categories. Significantly ahead across the board. And every time the gap widened and became more obvious, ESPN redesigned the statistical category. At 19 games played, Olivia Miles had 356 points. Caitlin Clark had 308 points. Miles looked good there. She had more points at that checkpoint, which is why that stat got featured. But look at everything else happening on the court. Clark led in rebounds 104 to 91. That's a 13 rebound gap. Clark led in assists 128 to 109. That's a 19 assist gap. That's Caitlin Clark ahead in 2 out of 3 major statistical categories, and she's doing it while having fewer total points. That tells you something important about the efficiency gap, about the playmaking gap, about the overall value being generated. That tells you which player was actually more dominant. Jump to 21 games. Miles had cracked 393 points, 101 rebounds, 118 assists. That's the exact moment when Miles finally crossed 100 rebounds for the season. And notice what happened right on schedule? That's when the July 13th graphic appeared. Rebounds got reincorporated into the statistical category because Miles finally cleared that bar that had been blocking her. But look at Clark at 21 games. She had 300-plus points, 119-plus rebounds, and 149-plus assists. Clark is still ahead in rebounds by a significant margin. Clark is still way ahead in assists. The gap hasn't closed. It's widened significantly between the two players. Fast forward to 24 games into the season. Clark has crossed 400 points with 142 rebounds and 188 assists. Miles was at 458 points, but only 112 rebounds and 141 assists. Think about that comparison carefully. Miles has more points, which is notable, but Clark has 30 more rebounds and 47 more assists. That's not a close race between two competitors. That's two completely different statistical profiles and production levels. Clark is generating more of everything that matters except raw point total, and Miles is only ahead on points because she's taking more shots at higher volume. That's a completely different conversation about shot selection and efficiency. At 25 games, this is the critical moment that exposes everything. Miles had 490 points, 120 rebounds, and 149 assists. She was 1 point and 1 assist away from hitting 500 points and 150 assists. ESPN was watching this number climb in real time. They knew it was coming. They knew it was about to happen imminently. They were counting down to the moment. And then something absolutely fascinating occurs. ESPN posts nothing. No graphic. No celebration. No Miles approaching historic threshold teaser post to build anticipation. Just complete silence. Why? Because 490 and 149 is not 500 and 150. The thresholds ESPN had started talking about, 500 points and 150 assists, are the thresholds they had already publicly mentioned in previous posts. And Miles hadn't hit them yet. She was close. She was right there. So if ESPN had posted at 491.49, they would have had to either celebrate an arbitrary threshold that didn't match their stated criteria or acknowledge that they were waiting for Miles to hit the specific benchmark. Either way, it exposes the manipulation. Either way, it reveals that someone was actively tracking Miles' numbers, and deciding when to post based on whether she'd cleared the specific threshold they'd chosen. That silence is the smoking gun of the entire investigation. That's the moment you know this wasn't accidental or random. That's the moment you know someone was watching. Because if ESPN was genuinely tracking fastest to 500 points and 150 assists as a real, predetermined record that had been established before the season, then they would have been waiting patiently for exactly that threshold. They wouldn't have posted about a 491-49 performance because it doesn't meet the criteria they had set. But they also wouldn't have been anxiously watching Miles' game logs, waiting for her to hit that exact number if it was just a random threshold. The real tell is what they could have done at 25 games if they wanted to keep the narrative going without being caught. They could have posted about 490 points and 149 assists and excluded rebounds again. Just like they did on the first graphic, just like they did on the third graphic in the sequence. They could have said, Olivia Miles fastest to 490 points and 149 assists, which would have technically been true and would have still allowed them to frame her as a record breaker. But they didn't do that. The threshold had been publicly established and mentioned as 500 and 150, so they waited for her to hit it. Meanwhile, at those same checkpoints, at 19 games, at 21 games, at 24 games, at 25 games, when Caitlin Clark hit comparable or superior marks, ESPN Insights said absolutely nothing. Complete silence. Same data available to everyone. Same game logs. Same easy access to the information. But complete radio silence. Clark hit 300 points, 100 rebounds, and 100 assists at an earlier game count than Miles hit any comparable threshold. If those numbers belonged to anyone else, if a different player's name was attached to those achievements, what would ESPN do? Wall-to-wall coverage guaranteed. A whole segment on SportsCenter. Social media posts going viral across the platform. Instead, nothing happened. Silence, because the narrative wasn't about Clark, the narrative was about Miles. The institutional decision had been made. And when the actual statistics threatened that narrative, they got rewritten or buried. Here's the moment everything falls into place and the entire conspiracy becomes visible. Here's the evidence that turns suspicion into absolute certainty. On an ESPN broadcast, Holly Rowe made a statement on air during an official broadcast. She said that Olivia Miles was the fastest player to reach 300 points, 100 rebounds, and 100 assists. She then added a crucial qualifier that changed the whole meaning. Not just for a rookie, any player. She was claiming this as an all-time WNBA record. An all-time record. Not just a rookie record. Not just a trend. An actual, legitimate, all-time WNBA record that had never been done before. Except that record didn't belong to Olivia Miles. It belonged to Caitlin Clark. Caitlin Clark had already hit 300 points, 100 rebounds, and 100 assists at an earlier point in her rookie season. So when Holly Rowe made that statement on air, she was either deliberately lying to the audience or she was working with information that ESPN had selectively withheld from her. Either way, it's a problem. Either way, it's proof of the conspiracy and coordinated effort. Think about what this moment reveals about the state of ESPN as an institution. A major on-air personality, someone trusted by millions of viewers every day, goes on the broadcast and makes a specific statistical claim about a record. She frames it as unprecedented, as historically significant, as something that's never been done before. And she does this on one of the largest sports platforms in the world with the largest reach. Casual viewers hear this and they accept it as fact without questioning it. They're not going to pull up game logs to verify. They're not going to cross-reference multiple sources. They're not going to fact-check Holly Rowe. She's an ESPN analyst with access and authority. She has information most people don't have. If she says Miles holds an all-time record, then Miles holds an all-time record in their minds. But she doesn't. And the fact that Holly Rowe went on air and said she did means that ESPN's internal communication system broke down completely, or that the information was deliberately withheld from her. Because if she had known that Caitlin Clark hit that same threshold first, she never would have made that statement. She would have said, Miles becomes the second player to hit 300, 100, 100, or she would have qualified it some other way. The only way she makes that specific claim is if she genuinely believed it was true. And here's the thing that makes this even worse than it appears. Even though Holly Rowe made a factually incorrect statement, it actually proves Caitlin Clark's dominance in the process. Because to reach 300 points, 100 rebounds, and 100 assists, you have to be generating historic production at a level that's almost impossible. You have to be doing things on a basketball court that almost nobody does. You have to be generational. Holly Rowe's statement was meant to elevate Olivia Miles and make her look incredible. Instead, it accidentally elevated Caitlin Clark by confirming that she reached the same threshold earlier. But ESPN's response to this contradiction? Silence. No correction issued. No clarification on air. No, actually, Caitlin Clark hit that mark first, so let me correct myself. They just let the false statement stand in the public record. They let millions of viewers walk away thinking Olivia Miles held a record she doesn't actually hold. That's not a mistake you make once and move on from with a quiet correction. That's an institutional choice to allow misinformation to spread because the misinformation serves the narrative you're building. And let's be clear about what that narrative is. It's the erasure of Caitlin Clark's accomplishments from the record books. It's the systematic rewriting of the statistical record to minimize her dominance. It's the construction of alternative facts through selective presentation of data. Holly Rowe's statement, the 4 graphics with shifting thresholds, the complete silence around Clark's achievements, these aren't isolated incidents that happened randomly. They're all part of the same coordinated effort to control the narrative. The coldest piece of evidence in this entire investigation is the 25-game moment. When Olivia Miles was 1 point and 1 assist away from the 500-150 threshold ESPN had telegraphed weeks earlier, ESPN posted nothing. That silence is intentional. That silence is proof that someone was watching the numbers like a hawk and deciding when to post. And it's proof that the threshold had to be real enough to be defensible if challenged. If ESPN had posted about a 491-49 performance and someone called them out, they could have said, "Oh, we're just celebrating her approach to the record." But they knew that explanation wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. They knew they had built a specific threshold intentionally. So they waited. And when Miles finally hit it 2 games later, after 1 more game, ESPN was right there with the graphic ready to go. But here's what matters most. During those 25 games where Caitlin Clark was generating historic production, 300 points, 100 rebounds, 100 assists, ESPN's Insights account said absolutely nothing. No celebration. No graphic. No acknowledgement that she was doing something unprecedented. That contrast is everything. That's the whole story right there. ESPN celebrated Olivia Miles before she hit the threshold. ESPN posted nothing about Caitlin Clark after she hit comparable or superior thresholds. The difference between those 2 approaches exposes exactly what's happening. It's not about tracking records objectively. It's about building a narrative. And they almost got away with it completely. The manipulation doesn't stop at graphics or numbers. It doesn't stop at threshold shifting and selective statistics. The erasure of Caitlin Clark extends into every corner of the sport like a coordinated campaign. And when you look at the full picture, the statistics, the voting, the on-court treatment, the media coverage, you see a coordinated effort that goes way beyond ESPN's graphics department. This is systemic. Let's talk about the peer voting and how it reveals the broader pattern. At the end of the 2024 season, Caitlin Clark was voted as the 11th best player in the WNBA by her peers. 11th. That's what the players themselves thought of her ranking. But here's the thing that makes that ranking completely impossible to justify logically. Clark led the league in multiple statistical categories as a guard. She was generating historic offensive production that guards at her stage of development don't typically produce. She was doing things that only the greatest players do. And yet the locker room voted her outside the top 10. That doesn't happen in a vacuum by accident. That doesn't happen unless there's a collective understanding about how you're supposed to view a certain player. That doesn't happen unless the narrative has been so successfully controlled that even the players themselves have accepted the framing. When you combine the peer voting with the statistical erasure we've documented, you get a complete picture. It's not just ESPN graphics department doing this independently. It's the entire ecosystem working together to minimize Clark's accomplishments. Then there's the on-court treatment and how she's guarded compared to other star players. The physical play, the flagrant fouls, the way defenders approach her. Reports suggest that Caitlin Clark was involved in a disproportionate number of flagrant foul situations, particularly during matchups with certain teams that had specific beef with her. Some of the numbers floating around claim that Clark accounted for a significant percentage of all flagrant fouls in the 2024 season, with an even higher percentage of those coming from one specific team. Now, these specific numbers haven't been officially confirmed by the league, so take them as context for understanding, not as gospel truth. But paired with everything else we've seen, the statistical manipulation by ESPN, the peer voting patterns that don't match production, the selective coverage, it paints a picture that's hard to ignore. It's a picture of a player who isn't receiving the same respect and protection as other players at her level. It's a picture of different standards being applied in different situations. It's a picture of a system that decided on a narrative and committed to it across every dimension of the sport. Graphics, voting, physical play, coverage, every element aligned to serve the same story. What makes this pattern so insidious and dangerous is how subtle it can be in isolation. One flagrant foul here, one aggressive defensive approach there, one peer vote that's just one person's opinion, one graphics post that's just one post. None of these things, individually, is obviously corrupt or wrong. But when you layer them all together, when you see the same pattern repeated across different institutions and different contexts, you start to understand that this isn't random variation. This is systematic. The respect gap is real. It shows up in how Clark is covered on television and in broadcast commentary. It shows up in how analysts talk about her achievements compared to how they talk about others. It shows up in the narratives that get built around her and how those narratives differ. She's not defended like other star players are defended by commentators. Her accomplishments aren't celebrated the same way. Her records are treated differently. Her impact is minimized or attributed to other factors instead of her own greatness. It's 1,000 small choices that, added together, create a narrative of a player who isn't quite respected, isn't quite valued, isn't quite fitting into the story that the basketball world has decided to tell about itself. And here's what's important to understand. None of this is actually about Olivia Miles the player or her abilities. Miles is a real player who earned everything she earned on the court through her own work. She played well. She generated production. She did the work. She's a legitimate WNBA player. The issue isn't with Miles as a competitor. The issue is that Miles is being used as a vehicle to execute something much larger. She may not even realize it. She may not even be complicit or aware. She's just a player having a season. But the way she's being covered, the way her accomplishments are being positioned relative to Clark's, the way the statistics are being constructed around her, that's not about Miles. That's about Clark. Miles is being weaponized, whether she knows it or not. She's being used as the protagonist in a story that requires Clark to be a supporting character or to be written out completely. And the tragedy of that situation is that Miles doesn't deserve to be part of a conspiracy. She's just a player. But the system that's supposed to be objective, about tracking records and reporting facts, has made her the centerpiece of a coordinated effort to minimize another player's legacy. When you step back and look at the full scope of what's happening, the graphics, the voting, the on-court treatment, the media narrative, you see something more important than basketball statistics. You see a system that has decided to rewrite the record according to its preferences and narrative. And that's a problem that extends way beyond one player or one sport. Caitlin Clark's records are real and documented. Her marks at 19, 21, 24, and 25 games are documented and verified in the official game logs. No amount of threshold shuffling from a graphics department can change what she actually did on that court. The box scores don't lie. The statistics don't lie. What she did is permanent and undeniable. The record is there forever, written in the game logs and statistics that will never change no matter how many graphics ESPN posts or doesn't post. What ESPN did is exposed and documented. They showed us their methodology clearly, and the methodology is corrupt at its foundation. They built thresholds to order based on what players had accomplished. They shifted categories based on real-time data. They celebrated Olivia Miles while systematically erasing Caitlin Clark from the historical narrative. And when fans started paying attention, when the side-by-side comparisons went viral across social media, they got caught red-handed. This is what accountability looks like when the system fails. Not from mainstream sports media, not from official league statements or investigations, from regular fans with spreadsheets and receipts who cared enough to verify the facts and document everything. You did this. You saw what the cameras didn't show and said what commentators won't. Courtside Leaks is where that truth lives and continues to be documented. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and when the next story breaks and the system tries to manipulate the narrative again, you'll be first to know. Because the box scores always tell the real story that numbers can't deny. They always have, and they always will.